Okay, everyone, welcome back to our Lunch with Larry series. We're talking today about standards access, how to get your external standards mapped into your requirement set so that we can assure that external parties who are interested in our design have all the requirements that they would expect to see in the design. So this is about standards access and how we create reuse libraries. So thanks for coming. This is just my contact list. We have the registration of the webinar if you'd like to give it to a colleague. Also, if you'd like to schedule a meeting or contact me, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That would give you more content as we put this out. Might give you some further insights. So feel free to contact us any way that you see fit. All right, so ideation capabilities. So when we start, and I just wanted to mention as we go into this process, we're really comparing notes because there's a lot of ways to do this. And especially when we start talking about traceability to standards and risk management, all these very core topics, there's a lot of different ways to do it. So what I'm really trying to do here is present an idea as to how it could be deployed, and then we can have a further discussion about the pros and cons of different ways to do this deployment. But I think it serves as a discussion point to kind of get to a place where we have a common understanding of the important elements in all this. So today we're talking about standards management. We in our previous sessions talked about requirements, V&V, risk management. Now we're up to standards. Next week is going to be systems modeling and how to do functional modeling and map it into the design as well. So that's today. So I just thought, as a matter of deployment order and methodology, that it would be a good idea to help you to understand in a progression how we would recommend that we deploy a system like this. So first is risk management or requirements management. Second is really this V&V, risk, standards, and then systems modeling in order of complexity. So I think it makes a lot of sense for us to think about this in chunks instead of trying to take the whole thing on at the same time and get everyone trained on every different aspect of how to do design. So I thought this is a bit of an eye chart, and I think one of the things that's really interesting about this chart is it goes to show how many external standards there are in an industry. And if you think about this just from a drilling perspective, you have offshore, you have the wellhead at the bottom of the ocean, you have different standards for drilling on land. And you can see here, there's probably 200, 300 standards associated with just drilling. And each one of these standards might have 60, 70, maybe more requirements. And a lot of these standards also have dashes. So you have dash 1 to dash 12. There might be 1,500 requirements that are associated with one standard. So what we need to be able to do is delineate all those requirements and then provide that traceability into your requirement set for the design you're doing. So it's really clear if we're saying we're compliant with an ISO standard, really what are the requirements we're putting into the design to assure that compliance? And then what is the evidence from a V&V standpoint that we comply with that definition. So this is just to give you a sense in one particular industry, the great complexity that you have to deal with when you're trying to satisfy external parties as to whether your design is going to be valid and perform as expected. So kind of an interesting graphic, I thought, to get us started in this discussion. Okay, so when we have this design deconstruction from user needs to system design, physical requirements, and process controls, what we want to do is break down those standards by clause. And what I mean by that is each section of the standard has a set of requirements, and I'm going to call that a clause. And what we are able to do then, once we do that delineation of those different clauses, we can trace them into the requirement that satisfies them or requirements that satisfies them so that we can run a report and show right away what is the satisfaction. How do we prove that our design is going to comply with that standard? If you think about this in levels, right? We have different libraries. So we have external standards that are defined by industry. We have what I'm going to call a normative library that shows how for a product type we're going to comply with those standards. So for example, if you're a company that builds, wellheads at the bottom of the Gulf, for example, you're going to have a particular way that you want to implement those external standards. And that becomes part of your IP as to how exactly you're going to show compliance with those standards. So what we want to do is first do the mapping into a normative standard. Then for every wellhead you build in the future, that's going to be a project. And what we do then is we share the standard down to the projects. So we get this atomic traceability between the clause and the requirements, which is between the external standard and the normative standard. And then what we're going to do is we're going to share the entire document, the requirements document for that product type down to the project. Now, the neat thing about this is it allows us then to make changes at the project level to either add new requirements that are specific to this particular design or delete things that aren't applicable. But at least this way, we have a place to start that's driven from a reuse model that allows us to trace between these company standards and the external standards. So the question you'd ask is, how is this project compliant with the standard? Well, now, because we have this traceability that's 3 levels deep, we can run a traceability report and understand exactly for this project how we're compliant with any particular standard that it's traced to. So a very powerful piece of work and very difficult to accomplish if you don't have that built into your traceability at the beginning. So what's missing in all this? Currently, right? If we look at requirements management tools, this traceability from document to document, external standards to normative to project, is baked into the application. But what is really kind of missing is this external standard import, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, where we're taking this standard and making it electronic so that we can trace it in object by object. The reason that's important is because we want sort of legal access to the standards. We want it to be the standards to be digital, not prose or not narrative, where people are just typing in words and we have to figure out what that means. And also we want to be able to get these standards in easily. We want it to be quick. So that's the piece of it that's sort of missing, but I think we can show how we can provide that as access in the future. Okay, so this is just to give you a graphical representation of why it is that we want these 3 libraries. And the reuse is really accomplished through the central library. Those external standards are shared through the library. So the difference here is really, oftentimes what people want to do is they want to share their requirements project to project. And especially if they're doing that as a activity that's built around documents, essentially what they typically do is take the project documents and they put it into a new project. And then they reauthor the documents and then they do that again for the next project. And the problem with that is the traceability to the external standards then goes from the external standard to the normative library to project 1 to project 2 to project 3 to project 4. So if I'm in project 4 and I want to say, how am I compliant with that external standards? I have to go through 5 different levels of traceability to understand what that external standard implication is. So in this case, when we share from only the normative library and not project to project, so in other words, we make a change in project 1. If we want it in the normative library, we move it back to the normative library so that we can share to project 2 through the normative library rather than project to project. And that provides this 3-level traceability for all the projects directly to the external standards. So I can just double click on a report and it'll show that traceability 3 levels back from the project or from the external standards down to all the projects. So it's important to think about how you're going to construct these projects so that you can get the kind of traceability that you want. Okay, so standards access. What we're doing here is we're taking these external standards and we're baking them in. The way we do that is we have an application that allows us to select the standards in PDF format as we need them. And the beautiful thing about this then is when we select that standard in the interface, what it does is it gives us a view of what the standard content is. And we have an extractor agent, which is an AI application that allows us to identify each one of the clauses, break them down, and evaluate not only is this the right standard that we want to import, first of all, is this a standard that has the content that we would expect it to have and makes sense for this particular project, but also it allows us to identify each one of the clauses and put those into a structured format so that each piece of the narrative is identified as an object in the data model. So that extractor agent sort of process is really important for us to get the identification of each individual element. So once that's done, we get a preview, and the preview says, okay, on the left side, what the section of the document is, the title of that section, and the description that's part of it. And a lot of times these standards are going to have tables, they're going to have images, and what the AI agent really does in its trained format is allows us to break these things down and bring in all these separate, disparate, different elements of the requirement in a way that is intelligent so that we don't import those in a way that doesn't make sense from the standpoint of how we want to process them in the design. Of course, once that's done, we get this decomposition, and each one of these lines then becomes a Plarian object. So we're going to import this into the document that is in Plarian, that is the external standards document, and each one of these columns is going to be an element in that work item. So we're going to have the section identified, we're going to have this title, and we're going to have the description identified as well. So now each one of these is going to be a work item inside of a document in Polarian. So this is just a view of what it looks like inside of Polarian. And of course, the whole point of Polarian is to have documents and or spreadsheets that have these logical elements defined inside of them. And in this case, it's going to be this standard requirement, a requirement from an external standard. And each one of those is then going to be broken down into its logical element. And the beautiful thing about that is then I can identify that, the requirement that satisfies it, and I can provide that traceability as a matter of reporting and maintain the linking relationships between each one of these objects. Now, as we go through this, what you're going to find is one of the challenges from a requirements management solution standpoint is we want to be able to import new requirements without changing these linking relationships, because I might have this document traced into 20 different normative library requirements, and I don't want to lose those relationships because one of the requirements changes. So one of the things we're also doing is having the ability to select a new revision of the standard. Once we do that, AI breaks it down by clause, and then we pull the standard that has already been traced in Polarian back to the tool. We do a comparison between the two, and we just update the content in the requirement that's changed rather than rewriting all these objects and having to retrace them. So this intelligence extends not just to the import of the documents, but also how are we going to maintain those objects in the database over time so that we can make modification to only the things that have changed and make some decisions about the linking relationships in the context of a red line document that shows the difference between the two. So that's really where we're going with all this. Okay, so then the second level of this is the normative company standard. And of course, what we want to do is have some reporting that shows what are the relationships between the normative library and the projects. And in this case, what you're going to see in this example is we have a design verification document that's been shared to one or more projects underneath it. So not only are we saying we're going to share this document, and the interface provides for that, so I can select the document in the normative library and share it down to any particular project or projects, but also we know the revision of the document at the time that it was shared. So the project's revision is linked to a historical revision of the document that's in the normative library. The beautiful thing about that is now, if I change the normative library, I can pull down an update to that document at the project level at a cadence that makes sense to the project. And so what we're really trying to do is bake into the system what is the historical understanding of that document and how was it shared to the projects, because we might have 100 projects this normative library was shared to, but it might have been shared in 3 different revisions over time, and you really need to know, okay, what is the current status of the whole portfolio? And you can imagine how hard it is to understand that and investigate that as a part of your management of your products over time, because each project is going to have been done at a different time and might have the possibility of having been associated with an external standard at a point in time well before, what the current revision of that document is. So this is really what we're trying to do, is get to a place where we have this historical understanding of what was shared at the time it was shared so that we can update those over time and get improvement to our products in a structured, methodical way. Okay, so the last thing is the project standard, and where we're sharing that document. In this last slide, we talked about sharing the document from the normative library down to the project. But in addition to that, we're going to want to look from the project up. So if we have a report then that shows what are all of the documents that have been shared from the normative library, not only that, but they were shared from where and what revision were they shared from, as I was just talking about a minute ago. So now we have 3 of these design input documents that have been shared down to the project at different times. So they are tagged to different historical versions of that document in the normative library. So now we understand clearly exactly what the content was at the time it was shared and whether it needs to be updated or not. And what this allows the project manager to do is pull down updates to that standard at a cadence that makes sense to the project. So you can imagine that there are certain situations where as soon as a new standard comes out, we need to revalidate to that new standard. But also there's going to be situations where we say, okay, this is a new standard, but we're not going to update the product for 6 months, a year. And we don't want to change the requirements in the project until such time as it makes sense for the project's update. So we wait 6 months, we pull down the new requirements, and then we go through a test protocol to provide evidence that it complies, and now we're been revalidated to the new standard when it makes sense to the project. So we kind of have these 2 views. What is the view of the normative library and how we're going to show compliance to any current standard, but then there's also the view of what things actually exist in the field and what are the differences between the different projects timeline-wise. So this is a really nice way to keep track of all that complexity. Okay, again, so we got the external standards library. That's traced atomically into the normative library. Documents are then shared to the project standard libraries, and that is really how we show this compliance with these external standards. So we have a partnership program. We have several different client partners that are involved in deploying and developing this software for creation of the external standards and maintenance of those external standards in Polarian. That's us, and then the client partners. And of course, the value that we believe comes out of this, and I always kind of want to get back to the value, is the ability to demonstrate compliance to the standard. That's primary. We have the ability to automate import standard documents, and we have the ability to update those Polarian documents to align with new revisions of the external standards. All this is a tremendous amount of work to show the compliance to any particular standard through this complex traceability. So what is the value of design ideation reuse? The first is really compliance demonstration. So the first question I would ask you is, how do you currently show compliance with those external standards? Typically, this is done with documents and manual research and understanding of which document are we claiming compliance to for each project. And that manual traceability turns out to be a lot of work. We typically have domain experts that analyze the new documents and then have a set of projects they're responsible for, so there's duplication in effort. The expertise is difficult to instantiate in your current library setup. So it's a very difficult process to understand, first of all, what standards are relevant to this particular project, and then also, what are the different historical revisions and how do we show in a reporting format compliance with every one of the requirements in the standard. So if we don't have a traceability setup like this, it's really very difficult. This new method is really 5 minutes and it's current, so we have a very rapid way to develop it. And so one of the questions you might ask is, how much reuse is possible? So in these different areas, we have requirements. I've seen up to 94% reuse from the reuse library to new projects. So if we take a project, we put it into the library and we reuse it, I've seen up to 94% reuse, which is an incredible time savings. I would say maybe more typically, depending on the complexity of the design, you might see 60 to 70%. If you're doing things that are simple projects, a lot of times the reuse is higher. More complex projects might be a little bit lower, but still you're going to, in a complex project where you have 10,000, 50,000 requirements, you can imagine a 50% productivity improvement on the creation of the requirements is really significant piece of work. Test case is another example. Risk management, development of the risk management and reuse of that into the project is also a great way to do it. The quality piece of this too, the data is vetted on previous projects driven from company product library. So the improvement is dramatic when we reuse these requirements over and over again, because what happens is those requirements become better and better quality and require less and less modification or evaluation when we go into production. We know how to test it. We know how to state what it needs to do. And the better we get at that, if we can build that into the learning of the organization, the quality of each one of those requirements gets better over time. So if you need a Polarian template for this, we have a bunch. And not only do we have this, as in the previous discussion, we talked about tools for development of risk management templates, but also the construction of the requirements and how to build these different projects out in a template. We have templates for all of that, so we can really get you to a place in a big hurry if you're interested in the methodology. So once again, this is my contact information. Please feel free to give me a call. I would be thrilled to help you in your projects. So thanks again for coming to Lunch with Larry. That'll do it for today. Next week is going to be model-based systems engineering and functional modeling, how that relates back to the requirement set. That should give us a complete understanding of our requirement set and give us all the different perspectives to make that requirement set complete. So thanks again. Have a great day.